something to share with you.
Let's share.
And tonight we're going to focus on Joseph and his story, as well as briefly touching into the Passover story.
And this is video 4.
5.
Yeah, it's 4. We put 3 in. Yeah.
Okay. So
we're on 4.
Okay, so to review just a little bit, the last video we started was Who is Israel? And so we touched on Abraham and Isaac and briefly on Ishmael and a little bit on Esau and Jacob, who was renamed Israel, and his 12 sons, which became the 12 tribes of Israel. And so we're going to focus on his most beloved son tonight, which was Joseph.
Beloved.
Yes, his favorite.
Dearly beloved.
As much as parents want to say, I don't have any favorites, I'm not going to sit here and say that because you love them all the same, but there's one that you always have a special bond with. He has a special bond with one of our daughters because she's always wanting to be around and hang out and help him do his tasks and stuff. And I love our oldest daughter. She's a Google's Magoo, but I have a special bond with our son, our youngest son. And so it's not that we don't love them all the same. Of course, I would die for any of my kids because they're my children. But there's always a special bond there, and that's kind of how this story begins.
And that's Joseph.
So
and Benjamin, but Joseph.
Mostly Joseph though, but Benjamin after. But so
yeah. Benjamin was
Rachel's second son. No, Benjamin was one of the 12 tribes.
That's right. Yeah.
He's trying to confuse you, I think. He knows this. So anyway, so Jacob, I'm going to kind of briefly lay out the story, if that's okay, just so we can get through. And this all is in Genesis. Just read the first book of the Bible. It's Genesis. Just read it. It's amazing stories. Bereshith is the Hebrew terminology for it. It means origins, like where we originated and where the origins of the faith came from, and etc. So anyway, Jacob had his 12 sons, and he would have them tend his sheep like that. They were sheep herders, and Joseph was kind of like the tattletale because he never did anything against his father. He always came with truthful reports, which oftentimes weren't good ones, because his brothers like to act up and do bad things. And to reward that, he gave his son a special coat. He had it specially made, and it was all different kinds of beautiful colors, and he gave it to him as like a present for being a good son. And the question arises, would he have given his other sons the same coat if they would have treated him with the same respect and dignity? And I feel like he probably would have.
Well, they weren't supposed to. It was
right. I'm not saying they were.
It's said later on, and Jim may get into it, but Joseph, Yosef, he actually points out to his brothers later on that everything happened like it was supposed to.
Yeah, we'll get into that in just a minute. Yeah, absolutely. So what happened was they got really jealous, and his father sent them out, and then he didn't want to send Joseph out because they were having issues with some dreams that Joseph was having and things like that, and they thought he had delusions of grandeur, and so they just really didn't like him very much because he was a tattletale. They thought that he was higher than them, and I'm not saying maybe he did, but it just doesn't come off that way to me in the story and the dreams that he had. But neither nor there. Maybe he was tooting his own horn in front of them. We don't know. We weren't there.
Boastful much?
Maybe. But
look what Daddy gave me.
Well, he was excited about it. Anyway.
You guys didn't get one.
Okay, so they come up with this plan. They hate him so much that they want to kill him. And the only two that stood against the rest of the brothers was Reuben, the firstborn, and Judah, which became the Jews, which then became the line leading up to Yahusha.
And he was number 4.
He was the 4th, so yes.
1 and 4.
Both of them were from Leah, which was not the beloved wife. It was kind of the wife he got tricked into marrying, as we mentioned in the last video, I believe. But anyway, so they stood up against the brothers, and they're like, look, you can beat him up or whatever, but like, you're not going to kill him. We're going to do whatever. So they ended up throwing him down a dry well, and he stayed there pretty much all night. in the morning, Reuben had gone off to get some rope to fetch him out with. In the meantime, Judah came up with a plan because the brothers were still intent on killing him. And so Judah's like, no, look, there's Ishmaelite traders. So these are kind of their cousins. He said, look, there's Ishmaelite traders, and we can just sell him to them and they'll take him to Egypt.
Yeah, we don't have to worry about it. We'll tell Daddy's dead.
Yeah. And so it's interesting because there's actually two, there's Midianite traders and Ishmaelite traders mentioned. And so I actually had to do some research, and what happened was they sold them to Ishmaelite traders who then sold them to the Midianites in Egypt. And then the Midianites sold Joseph to the Egyptians. So they fetched him out of the well, sold him into Egypt, and Reuben came back with the rope, but it was too late, and he was pretty upset, obviously, since he had intended on rescuing him, bearing any consequences that Jacob would have thought to give. And he's like, well, now what do we do? Because now we don't have Joseph. Well, they had taken his fancy coat off of him.
Right.
And so they decided to shred it up and kill a lamb and spread the blood on it and tell Jacob that a wild animal had killed him. And that's really not unheard of when you think of the stories of, say, David even further on into the future, where he's battling lions and bears, or Samson battling bears. So obviously there were, at least at that point, wild animals in the area. We don't see that much anymore today because Israel was pretty barren.
Some kid fell over the fence at the zoo. You know, it's
Sure.
about. I mean, that's about seriously.
Yeah,
like, let's cage him up and have accidents.
Are we having a Cat Williams moment?
Oh, okay.
Anyway, so we don't watch him anymore, but that was a pastime thing of ours. So anyway, just to clarify,
Cat Williams.
But so Joseph goes into Egypt. He's a slave. He's 17 when he's sold into Egypt. He's a slave for bare minimum 13 years. And he makes it to second in command of Egypt. And we'll go more into depth with that perhaps at a different time. But to save time, just know that he interpreted dreams for Pharaoh, and Pharaoh made him the ruler over all of Egypt. He said the only thing that separates us basically is my throne, and gave him a ring to show his authority and all that, which is usually the king's seal is on the ring. So any documents that he has, he can seal them, and it's the king's authority, essentially. So all of that to say, then a famine comes. So the dream that he interpreted, the Pharaoh had two dreams. One was gorgeous, beautiful cows, and then anti-fat, thin, starving cows, and the thin, starving cows ate the beautiful, fat ones. And then the second dream was beautiful, ripe ears of corn, ready to pluck and eat, or wheat, maybe, some kind of grain. The most common translation is corn, but we don't know that's exactly what it was. And then again, the weak ones, and the weak ones devoured the others. And Joseph interpreted that they would have 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine.
That's the point.
And so that's why he put Joseph over, or Yosef over, the entirety of Egypt and the regions that Egypt controlled, was so that way he could, because everything flourished under his hand. That's how he kind of worked his way up, is that he, everything he touched flourished, and he always prospered, no matter, he got falsely accused of raping his master's wife, and that's why he got thrown into prison after being a slave. Then he was a prisoner for, like I said, around about 13 years ish. And
everyone should go read, if they haven't. If you don't know the story, you should read it out of here.
I know the story because it's the one that I relate most to in the entire Bible. I love the story, and there are pieces of my life that I can see. It's obviously, I've never been a slave, but there are pieces of my life that I've felt imprisoned, or I've felt enslaved, or whatever. And there's betrayal from his brothers and things like that.
That's right.
But they come back together at the end of the story, and it's a beautiful moment. So
it is.
So
Family does
for
that
his,
throughout.
they do, yeah, and you have to be prepared for that. Like, don't think that just because you're having a fight with one of your family members doesn't mean that you're not still family. It doesn't mean you can't eventually rebuild some kind of a bond with them. You don't have to be as close as you were necessarily, um, but that's kind of what Joseph did. So this famine happens, and he sees his brothers. It's been 20 years or whatever. I mean, I'm throwing 20 out there. I don't know how long it was.
Probably have it written
But
down.
I probably do, but I'm not going to look right now. But anyway, so his brothers come because they're starving the land of Canaan, because it wasn't just a famine for Egypt, it was a famine for the entire world. And so people were coming from near and far to Egypt because that was the most prosperous region that
That's right.
they knew had grain stored up. So everyone's coming. So Jacob
Word
decided,
spread that they had extra food.
absolutely. So Jacob decided that he was going to send his sons, bearing Benjamin, at home. He made Benjamin stay because it was the last son of his favorite wife. Because Joseph and
Send
Benjamin.
his brothers, not his son. Send his brothers back to his dad, right?
No. Jacob, the father.
Oh,
sent
Jacob.
the-
I thought you meant
sent
Joseph.
all of the brothers of Joseph
Gotcha.
except for
Gotcha.
Benjamin.
Yeah. I thought you said Joseph because he sent.
I probably did. I don't know. I'm talking really fast.
That's
I'm just
okay.
trying to get the story out.
We're at 11 minutes.
Okay.
We're doing well.
Okay, I can do this because we're almost to the point where we're going to actually dive in. So I just have to get the story out there so you understand what's going on if you haven't ever read it. So Joseph's in command, and he's the one that's allowing people to take grain or whatever, right?
Right.
So the brothers come before him, and he immediately recognizes them, and he accuses them of being spies. He's trying to test them. It says in John, I believe, to test every spirit. And if you've been betrayed by somebody, you better believe that you need to test them and see if you can trust them or not again. This is one of many tests that he gives them. Then he sends them back, like you said.
Yeah, and he's changed enough to where they don't recognize him.
Yes, they have no idea who
Which
he
is
is
important.
at all. Yeah, they have no idea who he is. He just knows them. And he said the next time they come, they have to bring proof of their brother, or
Right.
he's not going to believe them.
They must have killed him too.
That's probably what
Yeah.
his mind was thinking. And so Jacob refuses, and they're running out of food, and his sons and his daughters-in-law and his servants and his grandkids at this point are all starving, and he's being stubborn. And he finally relents because he doesn't want to see his family die. And he is like, I guess, sacrifice one. We interrupt this regularly scheduled program to bring you the rest of the story of Joseph. So, sorry to interrupt, but we had actually gotten, I had actually gotten a little bit of the story wrong. So when I went back, because I was like, I'm going to check one more place, because we all know the Genesis and we all know Exodus. But there's another book. It's mentioned in the book of Joshua. It's called the Book of Jasher. And in the KJVs, they don't have the Book of Jasher anymore.
That's right.
But you can purchase it separately, or you can buy a Sefer, which is what we have, and it contains the Book of Jasher. I'm not sure.
And others.
And others. So I went back to the Book of Jasher, and I reread the entire story of Jacob through Moses. And it was quite a long read. And anyway, there were a lot of intricacies that I had forgotten. I read this book probably 6 years ago, something like that. And I decided to go back in there. So without further ado, let's finish the story. Yeah? Okay. So when we left off at the previous portion of this video, Joseph had received word from Yahuwah. So the word of Yahuwah came to Jacob. Sorry, not Joseph. Came to Jacob and told him, it's fine. Go into Egypt. You're going to be okay. Because even though he knew Joseph was there, he wasn't sure if Joseph was following Yahuwah still, or if his heart belonged to Egypt. In other words, if he was worshiping Egyptian gods. And so he said, I don't know what to do. And Yahuwah reassured him that Joseph was still following him. He was like, look, even though he's been there for a really long time, his heart still belongs to me. He's still doing everything that you taught him and that I've commanded for my people. He's still holding true to that. And so that gave Jacob the encouragement he needed to go see his son, because he was really distraught on when he saw him, if he was going to have to kind of not recognize him because of the fact that he was following other gods. But thankfully he wasn't.
I agree.
So, just to review, Joseph went into slavery when he was 17. He was there 13 years when he was promoted to second in command of Egypt. He was basically king of Egypt. And that kind of allowed Pharaoh to take some time off. I mean, he was still Pharaoh, but all the important decisions were left to Joseph for the 7 years famine and the 7 years of plenty, or 7 years of plenty, and then the 7 years of famine. So at 30 is when he stood before Pharaoh, and that's in Genesis 41:46. Do you want to read that?
Sure. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh the king of Misraim. And Joseph went out from the presence of the Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Misraim.
Okay, so just to show you, our numbers are on with that. We go only by the numbers that are given to us. And sometimes they make sense, and sometimes we have to do a little extra work to add them together or subtract, or they give us too many numbers. Anyway, I was never very good at word problems. So anyway, I gathered for 7 years, and then it says sometime in Genesis, it says sometime into the famine that his brothers came before him. In the book of Jasher, it says specifically about 2 years in. So these people had about 2 years worth of food, and they ran out, and that's when they went in to ask Joseph for food.
They's getting hungry.
So anyway, we fast forward through the story, and we're caught up to the brothers are now bringing Benjamin in because they came in without him, and Joseph sent them away and said to bring Benjamin. He brought him in, and Judah or Yehuda, he offered to take Benjamin's place as a servant. That's verified in Genesis as well as in Jasher. So you have your two witnesses there. And Joseph revealed himself and said, I am your brother that you sold into Egypt, after he tested them. Like I said, if you've had someone who has betrayed you, you really do need to test them, and not test them of like what you want to test them with, but really see the mistake that they had made to you and pray about it and see which way Yahuwah wants you to test them, because oftentimes we'll test kind of spitefully. And so you don't want to do that. You're like, well, I'm going to set them up and I'm going to make sure. And that's kind of the thought process, but you really need to be sure that you're following Yahuwah's lead on that. Anyway, so they are all crying and they're happy, and Pharaoh's happy. He had sent a messenger to Joseph, be like, what's going on with these Hebrew people? Why are they here? And so Joseph informed him they were his brothers, and he's like, oh, goody, your brothers are here. So he told him to go and get Jacob or Yaakov and bring him in. So they did that, and this was when Joseph was about 49 years old. I'm sorry, not 49, 39 years old. Get it right, Jennifer. And Jacob stayed there until he died, but he made his sons swear to him that they would bring him back to Canaan, to the land where he was born and the land where his fathers, Abraham and Isaac, were buried. And so they did that. And actually a procession went up from Egypt for Jacob with Joseph, and they mourned him. The Egyptians did, because that family was just so important to them. Because when the Hebrew people, the Israelites at this point, came into Egypt, Egypt was just thoroughly blessed with them and everything that they touched, and they were a really big blessing to Egypt. So they really mourned for the leader of this tribe of people, and because they loved Joseph, very curiously, they loved Jacob. So anyway, Jacob lived there for 17 years before he died. He died at 147 years old. And about 15 years later, 15 years later, when Joseph was 71, Pharaoh died. This is all in the book of Jasher. It doesn't give this much detail in the book of Genesis. It's just kind of like Joseph died in Egypt. And then in Exodus, it's like a new Pharaoh came in and made everybody slaves, but there's not really a lot of, Joshua fills in the gaps.
Yeah, how did they become slaves? How did they what were they doing during this time period to get to that point to where they were,
How did they allow
Moses and all
themselves
that?
to become slaves?
Sure.
Or were they just brutally taken over? And so what we see happening in Jasher is that, or Yashar, if you want to be specific about it, Joseph reigned for 80 years. But in Jasher, before Pharaoh died, he knew he was dying, he was on his deathbed. He made Joseph promise to be a father to his son and to reign until his son was capable of taking over the kingdom. So his son actually didn't take the throne, as it were, until he was 40 and didn't actually reign until he was 41. And that's not typical. So when you read in Josh of a dynasty, right? Like
Sure.
you can have kids as young as 10 years old on the throne, like the Ptolemies who took over Egypt, the Greeks.
Yeah.
You can have kids as young as 10 years old who are sitting on the throne and commanding the armies and things. Of course, they have influence from advisors and counselors and things. But anyway, what happened was when he was old enough to take over the throne, he actually gave the throne. He did the same thing his father did. He's like, I'm gonna sit on the throne, but you're gonna make all my decisions for me. And he did that until Joseph died at 110. So he took over at 41, essentially, as the one making the decisions, though he sat on the throne at 40. So still for the last year of Joseph's life, while he was potentially on his deathbed, it doesn't explicitly say that, but that's kind of what's inferred by the information, that Joseph was still he was still cognizant enough to make decisions and things. So if you do the math back, he was 41 when he took over, and Joseph was 71, and he died at 110. That means that Pharaoh's son was only like 5 years old when Pharaoh died. And is really important to understand on why Pharaoh would have been like, be a father to my son. Because if his son was already of age to take the throne, I don't think he would have said that.
Wouldn't have been the same,
Right. So then that kind of summarizes Joseph's story. He was revered. He reigned in total 80 years in Egypt, which is exactly so 17 when he was sold into slavery, 13 years as a slave slash prisoner, and then that's 30, and then he died at 110. That's 80. So literally for 80 years he reigned in Egypt. The book of Joshua gives a little more insight that while he was reigning in Egypt, he decided that he was going to take Egypt's army, as well as his own people, and they went and they conquered like the surrounding nations to expand Egypt even further, and their rule even further. The interesting thing that's pointed out is that though he did that, it's said that Pharaoh literally only reigned over Egypt itself, and so Joseph was kind of reigning over the other regions, as well as Egypt, but Pharaoh sat on the throne in Egypt, and the other places it was Joseph who was technically king of those places. Then that Pharaoh had a son, and I believe the son was born before Joseph died, but it doesn't explicitly say that, so I'm not gonna give you that. I'm pretty sure he was born before Joseph died. Neither here nor there. The second, so there's Joseph's Pharaoh is how I term it, right? The one who put him in power, and then the one he raised kind of as his son,
stepson,
sure, adopted son, stepson, whatever. And then there's that one's son. So when the third one came into power, when Joseph died, he decided that he was going to devise this plan for the Israelites, and this will lead into our Moses video. But he decided he was going to devise a plan. He disregarded everything that his father had told him about Joseph or anything he knew about Joseph, which goes in with the Exodus verse that says that he didn't know Joseph. It's in Exodus 1 if you want to read it really fast.
Sure.
And it's Joseph died. Please.
Right here.
Okay.
1:8. Now there arose up a new king over Mizraim,
which is Egypt,
which knew not Joseph.
Okay. So we looked up the Hebrew for this because I was like, well, that's kind of impossible for him not to know Joseph. And literally what that means is they either didn't actually know or they didn't acknowledge. So I'm sure since his father was raised by Joseph, he at least knew who he was, even if he never met him. But he just completely disregarded it after Joseph died and after his father died. And he took the throne and he decided that these people were really numerous. And his people came to him and was like, they're going to take over us. And, there's too many of them.
Yeah, yeah. If you keep
And
reading there, two verses later, it explains all of that, and then it goes
in
into
summary, if
it's
you want
very
the full
summarized.
story, go to Jasher because it's really long, really involved, and I like a lot of detail. Some people don't. Some people just need the basics.
He didn't know him; they
Um,
put him in as slaves.
yes, and so he devised this evil plan and said, what we're going to do is we're going to deal deceitfully with them. I'm going to conjure a cunning plan. So what they did is they took the peoples of the surrounding nations that now that Pharaoh definitely rules over because it was left to him instead of Ephraim and Manasseh, which are Joseph's sons, because they were learning under Jacob while this new Pharaoh was being trained in the art of reigning a kingdom, right? And so this new Pharaoh had learned the ways of the Egyptians, and he's like, okay, I'm going to take these people groups and these people groups, and we're going to at first have them volunteer to help fortify my city of Ramses that my father built for me, as well as another city. I forget the name of it. And so, of course, why would we not volunteer to help this guy that's helping us, that we're helping, etc.
Yeah.
And but the part of the plan was that eventually these other 2 or 3 or 4 nations would kind of dwindle out while the Hebrew Israelites are still going in there and working. And eventually they come back, and he said, if they complain to you, then beat them into submission, essentially. And as such, they were overtaken by the other nations that were controlled by Egypt. And so it says the third Pharaoh reigned for 94 years. So that's a long time to sit on the throne. A very long time to sit on the throne. And when he died, he left his kingdom to his second son, not his first son. Apparently, his first son was like dumb and airhead or whatever. So he left it to his second son that was just as cunning as he was. And that's the one that decided to put not just labor, but really hard, rigorous labor. And this one did too at the very end of his reign. He was like, okay, no, you know what? You guys are going to work even harder. And so the second son that was put into command as Pharaoh is also the one that had the babies killed that were boys
Right.
that were 2 years and under. And he also had the babies thrown into the river.
That goes into the Moses story.
Right. So that's the Moses part. So that's the summary of the timeline of Joseph and how the Israelites came into Egypt to start with. They were not tricked into going. They chose to go. And Jacob told them that he didn't really want to die in Egypt, but he ended up dying in Egypt, made them at least promise to take his bones back. Joseph kind of the
Yeah,
same
put him
way.
in a coffin, right?
And Joseph was kind of the same way. I think he probably felt that something was going to happen. I don't know that he was actually prophesied that something was going to happen, but
Maybe.
But he told them when Yahuwah comes to visit you in this land and bring you up out of it, take my bones with you. So he at least knew that he wasn't going to be alive whenever they came out. And the whole problem is that they did not leave Egypt when they should have. And that was part of the video before that we had to cut off. I had still made that point, and I'm going to make it again, even though you're only seeing this time, and say, you as humans, we oftentimes don't know when too much of a good thing is too much.
That's right.
And it can put us in really dire circumstances sometimes. And I also want to make a point about the reunion. I know I said it was like really beautiful and things like that, but I don't know if you've ever had, a fight with your sibling that lasted for a very long time. And when you actually finally get to that point where you trust them again and where they trust you and where you actually have a decent relationship after doing the testing and things like that. I personally do have that experience. And it's a really awesome experience. And it's wonderful to see where you could have been and where you are, and where you were and where
Sure.
you came from. Do you have any thoughts on this video?
I have none. Let's close it out.
Okay. So, all in all, we'll see you in the Moses video. Bye, guys. See you next time.
Boom.
If you would like more information, like and subscribe.